Gender and physics, and I write the question mark because this is somewhat of a problematic area, and I will not try to hide that. So what am I going to talk about today? I have to move it. First, I would like to spend a little bit about the theoretical background. How do we think and learn when we work on this issue of gender and physics? And then I would give you an example of two projects. A project in Lund that we call Gender Certification, which is interesting, and then also a more international project of gender innovation. And I hope, but I should warn you, I'm a time optimist. But I hope we'll have time, at least for my conclusion, also some discussion, because I'm really happy to see so many here, and I hope to get some input on this. So physics and gender. What could we say? Well, physics is considered as objective. If you ask a physicist, it doesn't matter who is the researcher, the student, the observer, and what kind of properties this person have. Physics is independent of that. So it's non-gender. There's no sex in physics. It's a sexy subject, but it's not sex. But at the same time, if you look at in the classroom and in the labs, in the history of physics, it's very clearly gender because it's dominated by men. So this is clearly a contradiction, right? The subject should be non-gender, but the classroom is gendered. You could also put it like this. The physicist looks out in the universe and observes that there is matter but no antimatter. Where did the antimatter go? This is one of the most prestigious and interesting questions in physics right now. And if you work on it, you are lucky because you're going to get funding. But the same physicist looks out over his classroom or his coffee room or his lab and notice, oh, it's dominated by men. Where did the women go? This question is considered a non-scientific. And if I ask my fellow physicists, why is this room dominated by men? The answer usually comes from non-scientific reasoning, because women don't like physics. They're born that way, or something. There's no method in that. And that's also very interesting. So what kind of theoretical understanding or models could we use, and maybe use to change things? I am going to refer to Londa Schiebinger a couple of times, and her roads to change. So that's one model. The norms has to be questioned all the time. So we have to all go around and say, what norms do we have here? And the stereotypical things that Simon talked about is very important. We have a technique that comes from Norway. It could be good anyway. It's a suppression technique where you look at how do we, men, for example, keep our power. We use it by suppression. And we also have to worry about the fact that gender is not only sex. It's also a lot of other things interacting, or what we call intersectionality. We have to have it as a wider concept. And always when we discuss this, if we want to change things, for example, to be more inclusive, it is easy to start to talk in an essentialist way. I mean, we should be more working with examples with the human body and the physics. And then someone said, yeah, because that's what women like. And then you are essentialist. We have no proof of that. But we should question how we usually do things, because if we change that, we might be more inclusive. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't mean that I say that women are a typical this and that. It's just that we have to change things. Londa Schiebinger, she has written a lot of books. And I like to think about her 3 levels of change. First of all, you can fix the numbers, right? And we very often work very hard on that. We think about just the problem I addressed here. Dominated by men, few women. How should we fix that? But you can also say you should fix the institutions or the culture. That's what we call gender awareness. We should be aware of gender issues. Or fix the subject. And this is a very hard question in physics. That's gender perspective. And I should say it's also a hard research question. How do you find the gender perspective of physics? Numbers, culture, and subject. That's the 3 levels. So let me give you an example how one usually look at the numbers. And you probably all have seen the scissors diagram, right? So if I take an example, chemistry would look something like this. Here is the percentage and of men and women, and we start with students and we end up with professors. And this is obviously called a scissor diagram because this is how it always looks like. Maybe even here it's dominated by women in the beginning, but the numbers go down and the men dominates. They do career better. Physics looks like that. It never becomes a scissor because they don't cross in the beginning. Now, here is the problem if you focus only on numbers. So for example, you say, we have to recruit women to physics. We could become more like chemistry. Great. But what happens here then? If we don't think further than that, if we don't start to think about the culture or, God forgive, subject, we are not solving the problem because in the end it looks about the same, right? So you know this model, this is the leaking pipeline, right? That's what people usually say. Women disappear because they are wasted. They disappear, you know, the pipeline and they disappear out into nothingness. But this is a very dangerous model because that means that we should change and save the women then, for example. I like a different picture, which is a very sexist picture, but it's the one I found. The vanishing box. You know, the magician who takes a woman and puts her in a box and then she disappears and she appears somewhere else. This is actually this is a better picture, right? Because it's not that women are disappearing from the face of the earth when they leave academia. They are choosing something else. And actually, we find more and more they're choosing something better. If there is anything better than Lund or Leiden University, I don't know. But so it's actually the academia who has a problem here, not the women. Culture, I would like to show you some about the culture. And the first thing our physicists to be encounter when it comes to culture are textbooks. But physics textbooks doesn't deal with gender, right? Well, I take a very popular textbook in physics. Fortunately, it's out of print now, but we used it until just a few years ago in Lund, and maybe you used it here in Leiden. It's very popular. It's written by Benson. It's a typical calculus-based introductory book. And I'm going to look at it from one point of view. How do you present things in picture, your visual presentations? That's a little project that I and a student did. We compared different textbooks. Now, we should have become slightly suspicious because this is one of the first pictures in this book. Now, is this inclusive physics? Well, we don't have to. Now, it's for physicists, for nerds like me. You know, this is beautiful because the plane is moving that, but still the bombs fall in a straight line, and that's what probably the author thought. But could this give other feelings, especially for the people who might have survived an experience of living down here? So this is certainly not inclusive, and certainly interesting that it had remained until the 2000s, 21st century, to keep one picture like that. This is another picture. Now we are in gender. This person the author wanted to show the magic trick, I almost said, the trick about parallel mirrors. And you all have been in this in amusement parks or in an elevator, right? There's two parallel mirrors, and you see an infinite number of pictures of yourself. Why the author picked Anne Margaret as in a transparent swimming suit, I do not know. But this is, of course, extremely sexist. And so you can ask, are there other pictures of women in this book? Yeah, there is a girl in a pink jumpsuit riding a pink bike. There is a javelin thrower, which is not stereotypically female. But then we go back to a ballet dancer and an ice princess. Those are the pictures of women I found in this book. This book, the latest issue, came out in the end of the 90s. Men then, are there pictures of men? Yes, there are pictures of men. There are pictures of men. This, and it's amusing when I pick it out like this. This book was used in physics in Lund, which I hopefully think as a quite progressive country or university. And it was until a couple of years ago when we actually discovered this. So it has to be brought up. We take it for granted. Men are brilliant scientists. Men are working in industry. Well, I don't know if that's a man, but since it's on the moon, it is a man. And they're lifting weights and they're climbing. All right, so culture. One thing that was mentioned here, which we thought about a lot, that's the problem of role models. We know from investigation it's very important to have role models in the classroom. Women who stand and teach physics. Teaching assistants that are both sexes or whatever diversity you want to promote. That is important. But I want to address something else. History of physics. Are there role models in history of physics? Yes. Do you know these women? Marie Curie, Maria Goeppert-Mayer, and Lise Meitner. Yeah, there are. So very often people then say, let's bring them up. Let's make sure that in our textbook we have as many physics brilliant idols as women. What is the problem with that? Well, it's very hard to dig down so far that you find as many women as men that we know about in the history of science, because they never came anywhere, right? And even though those are very brilliant, they are not, in our thoughts about them, the same level as Einstein. They haven't reached that level because they couldn't. So I would like to warn against creating a history which is a part of the culture of science, where you just bring up these women and make them, and then we do the same mistakes as we do with men. We make them idols. For example, if Lise Meitner, as you know, she actually escaped to Sweden before the Second World War, and it's a very touching story about what happened to her in Stockholm, where he basically got pushed away and by the scientists there. But in the First World War, she was a racist. She expressed very racist views when she wrote about letters about the war, the First World War, and why the Germans should win it. So idols are really, really complex. Here's another guy. I usually bring this up with my students. Why is Isaac Newton maybe the most famous physicist of all? Well, he's smart. He probably was smart. Is that the only reason? No, he was born in Europe. If he had been born anywhere else, we would have forgotten him. He's a man, yeah. He was born in the right family. He acted according to the norm. He had a terrible personality, some people said, so he could push his way forward in the society. And someone said, actually, he looked good also. He was handsome. I don't know. Maybe that's another. Yeah, maybe that makes it easier too. I do not know. What I want to say is, how we talk about the history of physics is very important. It's actually been a research done by a Norwegian professor called Reidun Renström. She looked into how history of physics was described in textbooks. And it's not surprisingly wrong. The history that our students read about physics in textbooks is changed so it fits physics or the way we want to think about the physicist. They were not wrong when they came up with their ideas. They got the idea and all that stuff. And maybe these idols is not the right way to go. Maybe we instead should explain why didn't the women come forward? Why do we have so few women, for example? And why were all the brilliant scientists from Europe that we read about? And something about the sociology of science. That makes us also maybe appreciate that science and physics has changed. Or hopefully changed to something more collective than... Anyone who saw the introduction or seen anything of the Nobel Prize ceremonies, which is is very embarrassing for Sweden, because in the background you have all the men sitting there, and then sometimes you see by a color of the clothes that there is a woman among the brilliant scientists also. There's another thing that we also have a problem with in physics, and that is that it's superior. And I would like to give you some examples of that. Are we humble? Sometimes we think that we have the only and the best description of the phenomena. This is picked from a physics textbook. This family of elementary particles together with their antiparticles is all we need to describe and understand our world. I should add, before that, this person had said something about the forces also. But some research has been done. What happens in people when you write something like this? There's another example in this same book where they talk about the rainbow. And the rainbow is a brilliant and interesting physical phenomena, and the theory of the rainbow is wonderful. But then this author goes on and say, and there are all these other thoughts about the rainbows, like there is a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. But everybody knows that a rainbow has no end. And I mean, rainbow is a very important symbol, and I guess maybe some of you know it better, in religion, for every human being. Maybe you fell in love looking at the rainbow, whatever. There are other experiences. The scientific explanation is wonderful, it's great, I'm a positivist and everything. But if you always knock down all the other feelings, ideas about things in the world, you're in trouble. We are not that superior, really. From a physics, we are removed from reality. It's a Sudoku game. The best thing in my research is that it has no practical applications whatsoever. Those professors have problem to get funding nowadays in this time of innovations, but anyway. If you want to learn more about the environment that physicists are working in, there is a Sharon Travick's book I can recommend, Beamed Lines and Lifetimes, where she looks at physics lab and see how we behave. Among other things, she looks at the differences between the United States and Japan, and this is very interesting. She wants people to define what is a good leader in physics. What is a brilliant physicist? In the United States, in SLAC in California, it's defined as someone who is quite ruthless and competitive, standing above a strong leader, as we in the Western world would define them. In Japan, they define someone who can compromise and collaborate. And now I'm stereotypical, but that's the answer she got. But in both cases, those very different abilities are male. So the good leader in the United States, competitive, but it's a man. In Japan, collaborative, but it's a man. Women in Japan, Japan was considered as too competitive, which is very interesting. Now, before I leave now the theoretical part of this question is very, very interesting, right? Is there any gender bias or anything that affects the subject of physics? It's very hard to believe that, isn't it? The quarks, the Big Bang and all that. But there is a very good I didn't understand this book. I'm from physics and natural science, and this is written in a language that I don't understand very well because it's sociology and it's so complex and complicated and so many pages. I must admit that. But and this is the problem, communicating this idea. But basically, if I can extract some of the ideas in it, Newtonian physics are, you know, the word is on a stage and we are the audience. Just like you don't, well, you might think you don't affect my talk here. You do, because how you react will change what I say. But anyway, Newtonian physics is that way, right? And extremely positivistic. Quantum physics, according to Karen Barad, by the way, she's an elementary particle physicist, so she's someone described her as the cat's meow when it comes to gender and science, which is the first time I heard that expression. I like it. Quantum physics might offer something different, according to Karen Barad. Entanglement. Actually, that the observer and reality is entangled. And what we decide to observe decides what we are observing. She called it something like reality, experiment, and observer is entangled, and where does the experiment end? This is very interesting. I don't understand it. I'm not sure it's right, but it's interesting discussions. So that was a little bit about the background and how we think about it, and I hopefully maybe motivate you to think that physics and gender has something to do with each other, at least in the culture. And I would like to describe to you the gender certification project. When we enter into a project like this, there are 3 words that are important, but not too much. We should, first of all, we should trust. We have to trust that our institution, whether it's Lund or Leiden or anything else, can change. If we don't do that, we are lost. It will take time. There's no quick fixes. I always get the question, can I have a list of what I should do to be gender aware in my next course? No, I cannot give that. I can give some hints, I can give some startups, how we think, how we realize that we're all biased and so on. And we have therefore to be patient. Very often people ask the question, why doesn't anything happen? So we decided to do an investigation of that before we started. Why is it so slow? So we interviewed leaders and asked them, well, the question is it resistance or is it lack of knowledge? So we have interviewed deans and other leaders all through, mainly in the science and technology, engineering faculties. What do you think about gender and science, for example? And what we found was very few that expressed resistance. Well, actually none. But they showed curiosity. They didn't know. So I wish I had a mentor with me all the time who told me how to be gender aware and not to discriminate. Someone who walks beside and kind of a slave that says, no, now you discriminated. I mean, a willingness to change but not knowing how. Or I can't see how I teach about electron orbits could be affected by gender, but maybe I'm wrong. Lack of knowledge is the problem. So how do we usually do when we should start a change in a university? And how did Lund University do? Well, we did this. Year 2001 to 2005, we formulated a policy for equality, right? And one of the things it says is that gender perspective should be mainstreamed in all education and research, I could add. Okay, and then the vice chancellor, 2 years after this period ended, he commented, in spite of these wordings, we can only conclude that aims to employ a gender perspective and a gender-sensitive teaching has had a limited impact over the years. In spite, one believed so strongly in the fact that you just have to write it in the policy and then it's going to happen. But you can imagine what happens when this policy comes down to the physics department. We actually wrote down from the steering group from equality, we wrote out to all the departments and said, how have you worked with this? One, seriously, not jokingly, answered, well, we don't have any women employed in our group, so this is not a problem. And I mean, man can joke about this, but that's what happens. Of course, you say in physics, well, this could not be about us because there's no gender perspective in physics because we have not learned about that. We have not been taught. So the startup was then that we put together a committee similar to some committees. The committee was described here before, and the idea was to explore and illuminate the feasibility of using some type of certification to accelerate and increase the visibility of the work towards a broad inclusion of relevant gender perspectives and so on. And this was left to 2008. And we also got money for it, which is not unimportant. I really want to point out that if something should work, we have to get support. Money has to be put into this. 3 parts. The report that we created had 3 parts, and this should go out then, right, to the organization. First of all, you have to explain what is gender. People do not understand that. What is certification? Well, with gender, as you know, that's a social constructive sex and so all that. But what is certification? Certification happens to, well, is something where you show that we have reached a certain quality, or we can live up to certain standards, right? And we there came to the conclusion it's that the institutes themselves should decide, but there should be a third party that comes in and check it. And there should be certain criteria for certification, right? And those we formulated. You can always ask, if you put in criteria for gender certification, you can ask yourself, should it be quantitative and qualitative? Well, quantitative criteria, what should they say? Not more than 5% of our students should be harassed. That's not, I mean, and even when you pick criteria, you are qualitative in your choice of criteria, right? So qualitative aspects are important. Discussions makes a change, and I hope to be able to show that. Students have to be involved all the time from the beginning and influence our work. It has to be voluntary, that we came up. There's been certain, this cannot be forced. And the process is important. And the criteria we formulated were in the form of questions. I'm not going to bring up the criteria here, but I just say they were about gender awareness, which is about how is the culture, who dominates the room, who gets the funding, and so on. Gender perspective is about the subject. We have there things that there is research on gender perspective in all subjects. So, of course, knowing about that research is a good starting point. Plans and strategies should be in place, and the plan should be very operational. There should be, say, we should do this, this person is in charge, this is how much it costs, and it should be reported back at this date. So you should be able to follow up. And then, of course, we should work very actively on prevention of harassment and discrimination, which we know is a problem all over the university. We recently did an investigation of our staff, where it turned out that 7% of our staff has been harassed. 7%. 13% has observed harassment. I don't know what the numbers is in Leiden, but I would be surprised if they differ very much. The first phase then was that the Vice Chancellor invited departments. Now, voluntary, right? Who wants to do this? 3 departments volunteered. Who do you think volunteered? Physics volunteered, yeah? The other 2 then? They almost joined, but then they got scared because they got a dean then who said, well, there's actually some people doing research on gender here, and wouldn't this favor those people compared to others? And the other argument we often find is from social sciences and other, sorry, I don't mean to, yeah, anyway, is we know this already. This is a non-issue. But you should go and talk to the scientists and the engineers. They have problems. And these 3 departments volunteered. All in science, natural science and engineering. That's interesting, isn't it? I have not, yeah. In social science faculty, I should say, they decided to do something similar, but we cannot call it gender, and we cannot call it certification. Interesting. Let me just go in now, because I want to have some time for questions also. But some facts about, now we go to the Department of Physics. Now it becomes the concrete, what happens. First of all, what is our physics department like? We have over 300 employees, about half of them are faculty, and of course, passing through our department, there are thousands of students. We have 7 divisions, not interesting exactly what they are, but more interesting is that we have some system in Sweden where we appoint center of excellences. I think you have something similar probably in Holland. They get special money, lots of it, because they're excellent. And that's combustion physics, laser physics, and nanomaterial science. It's just interesting I'm not bragging here, even though I'm called Brage, I'm not bragging. It's actually just for the continuing discussion. What did we do? Well, we think about it like this. There are 3 stages, or some important stages. First, since we are aware of that physicists do not know much about gender and science, gender and physics, we have to start with education, information, and now infiltration. And infiltration, is actually a positive word. That means mainstreaming, getting it into people's way of working. So I don't mean like we should fool people to do it. We should get it into the everyday work. And during education, if it's done in a good way, ideas come up in your head, and those should be captured, and some of them be realized. So that's what I mean there. And then we should, of course, be evaluated, and then continued process. It's interesting is that when we talk to people during this process, we asked, how should we be rewarded when we're certified? Should we have a gold star? Should we get higher funding? Most people involved in this project said, no, that's not important. After half a year working on it, said, the process is more important. This is interesting in itself and important in itself. So they forgot about the idea of certification, became a non-issue. So certification was only there to focus, and then it disappeared out. Do you know what I mean? Step 1, what did we do? Just to show you. We did the See the Human Beyond, which is a workshop, half-a-day workshop with all our employees has gone through, more or less. It talks about, it starts in a very non-dangerous way with laws and regulations, goes to research, investigation, then they work on cases, and then they evaluate their own workplace. So the idea is to come back to their own workplace. And it takes up all grounds of discrimination. We had a symposium that actually did the same, asked the question straight out. What does gender have to do with physics? And it was very important that this symposium was just as fun and as much food and stuff was served as in a physics symposium, so it should have high priority, just like you do here, right? It's important to lift these. This is not something we do and then we get maybe a cup of coffee afterwards. We get the same conference dinner afterwards. And one thing that was very important here we found is that the experts who were giving a talk during this first day, was physicists who had become gender scientists, because that was less threatening for it was actually a very good move to use those people who used to be physicists, and then that was easier to make our staff listening to them. We put together a reference group. You have to have the key persons involved. We had an information meeting for everybody, questionnaire and interviews. We wanted to see what happens to physics during this process, so we need to know what it looked like before. We started a course, Gender in Science and Technology, and it's open both for teachers and students. And we had half days, but we just discussed. We gave talks about gender awareness and gender perspective, and then let people sit in groups and say, you come up with ideas. You don't have to do them. You're not promising to implement whatever ideas. But all the ideas that came up was collected. And then we started to realize the ideas that came up. Students put together a credit card size wallet about information All our students get information on gender and physics. Some of them reads it also. I should be honest. We renewed our course evaluation with questions related to gender. And here it's very important not to ask the question, did this course have a gender perspective? If you write that on a physics course, you get question mark to return, of course. But you can ask questions like, do you think that all students and all groups of students were equally listened to and had a chance to express themselves? Explain what you mean. And then it became, we actually got answers, we were useful. Money, funding for projects. Employees and students can do that. We have a conference on gender innovations, I'm coming back to that. Bookshelves with relevant literature about gender and science is traveling through our lunchrooms. And in Sweden, the coffee rooms are extremely important social meeting places. So this is a very important place to be. A gender coach was employed for 25%. She walked around and supported the divisions. And that coach was actually involved in the most sacred of all things, the budget preparation. So when the physics department prepared the budget, our gender coach was actually there and looking through if there was any processes that were monitoring for gender and equal opportunity. A thing that came out from this, unfortunately, parenthood and equality is very closely linked. Yes. So we have decided, even though it costs us 1 million Swedish crowns a year, which is about 150,000 euro, all PhD students who become parents and have a parental leave, they get double time back. So they not only get to continue their PhD with the same amount of time, they get twice as much. And the interesting thing is that many of our male PhD students are now taking parental leave. So it's interesting how this works in many different ways. That was not what we, Evaluation, there is a book of methods which talks about the projects we've done, how to handle resistance, advises good ideas and mistakes. It's an evaluation of the project. Unfortunately, the book of methods is so far only in Swedish. Evaluation of projects have been through and so on. But what happens now? What happens without us steering it then? Well, the 3 centers of excellence, as I remember I talked about them, they all started to do things. The first one I'm going to describe in a bit more detail. They did lots of work. One of them started mentorships in the group, and they also made discussions groups and visualizing gender roles. From simple thing, who makes the coffee in our coffee room? Who always cleans up? Who get to speak out most? Division 3 has started the discussion group. So those very excellent environments have started by themselves things. So let me just show you a little bit about Division 1. This one is probably in some sort of a transformation. They started very early to have gender symposia. They invited people in their specific topic. And I can say now that this is about combustion physics. Traditionally, this group was only male lecturers. There were only male postdocs and only male PhDs. There were women employed. They were secretaries. But they realized that this is a problem, and they wanted to change. Now, one senior researcher, after all these things they've done, is a woman, and they have about a quarter of the PhDs are women. So what happened? Maybe, if we now look back in a wording that I'm going to introduce to you just after this, but just tell what you can find. First of all, they worked very clearly on understanding what gender assumptions, what assumption of gender they had in their science by having workshops. So understanding gender assumptions. They rethought their teaching. They changed the concepts, they changed the language, they thought about who was teaching, etc. And they recruited students in a different way. And also, there was a change in research questions. They went from investigating what's happening inside the engine to also ask about environmental, the atmosphere. Now I'm becoming essentialist, right? Because now I say that this one is more female than that. I don't. I just say what happens when they started to discuss these issues, they also change their research. Is this linked? We are trying now to do a thorough research on this. We applied for money, and we're going to do in-depth interviews with people, and they describe the change. If you want to learn more about these methods that I used here, you can go to the Gender Innovation homepage, and all these things is described there. And we pick the questions, how we analyze what the change comes from here. And here's the link. I can send this as a PDF, and maybe all conference participants can get the PDF of it. Conclusions. Physics might seem genderless, but I hope that at least you agree with me, at least the culture is very gendered. To consider gender and physics is important from a democratic point of view. We all should have the right to study physics without being excluded or feel excluded. But it's an interesting, and that's why I'm working with it. It's an interesting, exciting, and challenging question. What does gender and physics have to do with each other? And I think that's what our faculty understands, and that's why they think this is a fun, how one can enjoy so much pain, but a fun project. And I think also it's clearly, as you can see, what's happening when you widen research, when you include more diversity, it's a matter of excellence and better innovations. So the advice I would say is that find a focus project, something that focuses your attention, and start discussion, and things will happen. Thanks for your attention.